government was never intended to have information on all the citizens of the United States. In order to get that, they were supposed to have a warrant. It didn't matter how they claimed they could get it, like third-party doctrine or any of that. That intent was in the Constitution from the very beginning. They were not supposed to have it unless they had a warrant with probable cause.
So if privacy is our protection to keep our hard work from being plundered, can you compare that idea to that of Soviet Russia or the Stasi in East Germany?
Yeah, directly, simply because those were the targets that I was working in NSA while I was there for almost 30 years, and it was their entire point was they had to know everything about their population they possibly could, so they could control it. I mean, that's what the Stasi did. That's what the KGB and the NVD, Ministry of Internal Affairs, in the Soviet Union did. So they kept track of everybody as best they could, and except they were doing it all manually, keeping manual files and things like that. They didn't have anywhere near the capacity we do now with the electronic age and the digital age and the software and the programs and the access that NSA does. So it's directly analogous, except it's in electronic form, not in paper form.
So it's not exactly history repeating, but it certainly rhymes, and now they have more technological power to carry out what they're trying to do.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
How's an average individual adversely affected by NSA surveillance?
Actually, it's hard to say there's any immediate impact on the individual per se, not yet anyway, unless you become a target or try to get politically active and are espousing principles or other directions or advocating for other kinds of operations for the government that the current administration doesn't like, in which case you can become a target. Like the Tea Party and the IRS, how they're using this data to go after the Tea Party. It's how you use information about people. It's power over people. If you don't like what someone's doing, you use that data against them.
Have they gone outside the limits of the Constitution?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was my complaint from the very beginning. When they started this domestic spying in 2001, the most recent iteration of domestic spying, I would add. This goes back to at least World War II with Program Shamrock, and after that...
and Minaret, yeah.
And Minaret. Well, that was during the Nixon times when he was after the anti-war protesters.
That's
and
right.
Other people didn't agree with his administration's position. He got the FBI using COINTELPRO, the CIA with a program called Chaos, and NSA with Minaret. Those were programs all oriented against these people that the administration didn't particularly care for, opposing the war and so on, and they were the ones then collecting the data for the administration and doing things like in COINTELPRO trying to get people to commit suicide or manipulate people in different ways, using the information that was collected from Minaret, Chaos, or COINTELPRO.
What happens when we have regulation without representation?
Well, you have basically what's going on in that case is that you have an uninformed electorate being duped by current government and being told lies and repeated lies till they get believed. I mean, that was the general principle of Adolf Hitler. If you're going to tell a lie, make it a big one. Tell it often until it's believed. That's the principle they're using, repetition. Like it's all legal, it's all legal, it's all legal, except in the case when they had to give retroactive immunity to the telecoms, or except now in the case where they have a bill in Congress that's giving retroactive immunity to the internet service providers. Why? Because they've been committing crimes. And they're liable if not if the Department of Justice is not going to take them on in criminal court, which they're not. Others have the option to sue them in civil court, and that's why they had to give them retroactive immunity.
What actions are people taking today that are, with respect to technology, kind of naive in the current environment?
Well, one of the biggest ones is Facebook. I mean, people are putting their whole lives out there on Facebook. They don't realize that that's being captured. The FBI, for example, looks at Facebook as one of the richest environments for them to investigate. So, but it's also being stored and captured by and used by different agencies, like NSA is pulling that data in, as well as corporations. They're also using this data. So, I mean, it's the kind of thing the corporations are more trying to sell you something. It's more of a marketing kind of approach where they're trying to figure out what you like or the kinds of things they should send or push advertisements to you. Whereas the FBI is looking at it for ways and means to, if you're being targeted, ways and means to either arrest you or take you out or put you in, like they did with the CEO of Quest, Nacho. They put him in jail, like they tried to do with Tom Drake and like they tried to do with us. Try to use that information to build a circumstantial case and they basically fabricate evidence, which they did in our case. The difference between government, which is more malicious than industry, is they're really still doing the same kind of thing. They're invading the privacy of everybody, and people are actually helping them by putting all this information out there, either in Twitter or in Facebook or any number of other ways, like an email, for example. That all that kind of information is being collected and it's being used against them.
So there's a tight relationship between the corporations that are spying on us to collect our private data and the intelligence communities that are also scanning for metadata or stealing it out of Angry Birds, as I heard Mike Hayden once say. You know, he's like, Angry Birds is already stealing your data. We're just sniffing their stream as it goes to Angry Bird Central, I think was his quote.
Well, and they also, the program they're using to do that kind of sniffing is, the primary program is Fairview. That one has between 80 and 100 taps on the fiber optic network inside the continental U.S. It's on the web. You can go take a look at the different fiber optic tap points, but that's how they're acquiring the information as it's passing by on the fiber network. That was also it was also mentioned along with other programs as the upstream program in the PRISM slide that was released by Edward Snowden. Also, it was the first one. Fairview, Stormbrew, Blarney, and Oakstar were the ones that they listed. Fairview, the first three I think were all U.S. corporations. The Oakstar is foreign corporations. So those were there are about 8 of them, I guess, according to the data that's been published. Poland was one of them, some Polish telecommunications company, but I don't. The others haven't been released by the Snowden material anyway. But they're foreign companies, so it's a mixture of U.S. and foreign companies around the world, along with foreign governments. And if they don't get cooperation either from the companies or the governments, they'll unilaterally do it. So they have a massive tap network on the entire internet and the fiber optic public switch telephone network. So that's a huge data acquisition system.
How necessary is it to the collection of intelligence that you map out the social networks of your targets?
If you're focused on targets, that is groups of individuals doing something illegal or criminal or some terrorist group, that's a legitimate operation of intelligence. Try to figure out potential adversaries or potential threats. That's legitimate. Every country in the world would say that's what they do or want to do too, within the means and capabilities they have. But when you start mapping out the social networks of everybody on the planet, that's a totally different issue. Now you're getting into the privacy of everyone that is not even a threat. So you're accumulating information on everybody in the world and all of their activities, everything they do. And it basically gets down to the ability, even after you accumulate that, you can look at their profiles and begin to see how they think and what they're thinking about issues. And you can even begin to project how they will act or react to situations. Although right now they're not very good at that. There is a capability to do that, and we have been able to successfully do that in the past. And they're attempting, at least, that's one of the initiatives that the White House let I think in early 2012, they led a big White House Big Data Initiative, which was a solicitation from industry to work out algorithms that would go into large data sets to figure out what's important for people to look at. That's how you automate the process of analyzing all of this data to boil that down to what's really important, which they should have been doing in the beginning, and they could have done right at the beginning, which is what we did in our program. ThinThread which would pull out only that data that was relevant to groups or individuals intending to do something criminal or terrorist type activities around the world, or other governments or leaders and so on. All those were legitimate intelligence targets, foreign intelligence targets. They could have done that right from the beginning, instead of having this knowledge about everybody. What that's done is give them an entire rich database for other agencies of the government, like the FBI and the DEA and the Department of Homeland Security and the IRS, to go in and examine everybody in the country and everybody virtually on the planet that's using internet or phone networks.
So they're spying on everybody, collecting metadata, they're building profiles out of it. What is the reasoning behind pointing such an apparatus at the American public? And what type of money, what combined budgets of these type of projects focused on the American people, what are we looking at?
But the reason that I came up with that they were doing that is primarily for money and building an empire. The reason I say that is because if you take the position of collecting only targeted information against groups doing bad things, then you have a finite problem. So you don't have to have large storage facilities like Bluffdale in Utah, or another 400,000 square foot facility in San Antonio, Texas, or another one they just started building last summer on Fort Meade in Maryland, 600,000 square foot facility to store information. You wouldn't need any of that. Plus, you wouldn't need all the contracts for contractors, and you wouldn't need to have a larger workforce. But you would be focused on a rich environment of information, which actually would mean you would succeed at preventing terrorism and preventing crime, international crime, and so on. But by taking in the bulk acquisition, that means you're taking in everything in the world. That means you're pulling in all kinds of huge amounts of information, hundreds of terabytes per day, going around the network. That becomes a management problem of information to begin with. How you have to build this infrastructure to transport it to storage facilities. You have to build the storage facilities. You have to have contracts for all this to happen, and contracts to manage all the data once you've captured it, and then contracts to build other kinds of programs to manipulate the data and use it for analysts and so on, and then hire more analysts to analyze data because there's orders of magnitude more data to look at. So and it builds your budget so much bigger, and so now you're managing a much larger empire. So they did it, in my sense, for empire.
Well, they told us they were doing it for the prevention of terrorism, so that would mean none of these programs were underway pre-9/11, right?
Well, there was clearly an intent to do it prior to 9/11, and certainly there was in history, down through history, with program Minaret at NSA anyway, and Shamrock. Those programs, they were doing that all the way back to World War II. Those are the programs that came out with the Church Committee investigation into NSA, FBI, and CIA back in the mid-70s. And as part of that, that's when the FISA law was written, and that's when the intelligence committees were created, the Senate and House Intelligence Committees and the FISA court. They were all created to have oversight of the intelligence community to ensure that they did not do domestic spying. So that oversight was supposed to prevent this type of domestic spying. Instead, now they're all advocates for it. The courts, the intelligence committees, they're all advocating for NSA to do this kind of thing, all under the false pretense that it's going to prevent terrorism. Well, what it's done is made their what it's done fundamentally is add orders of magnitude more data for their analysts to look at every day, and they can't get through that data, and so they're dysfunctional, and so we don't stop things like the Boston bomber, the Fort Hood shooter, the Times Square bomber, the underwear bomber. People are trying to do things that they should have been stopped. Even 9/11 should have been stopped, but even with the data that we had, but it wasn't. That's because their analysts are dysfunctional. They can't function under the environment they've created for them.
Well, they're incentivized to keep filling up their budgets and expending their budgets so they can keep growing their budgets and grow power. But what occurs to me is there's a historical relationship between mass surveillance on a population and the crushing of dissent of that population. Can you explain that?
Well, that goes back to like Caesar Augustus, I would say. Anybody that opposed him, you needed to know about it first of all, and once that happened, they would disappear. Well, the same was true of the Soviet Union or East Germany with the Stasi. you said anything out of line, you ended up in jail. I mean, or in a sanitarium or something, or in a gulag somewhere. That same was true of the Nazis and the Gestapo and SS. They would do the same to people. So this is historically true. This is the way totalitarian states operates, and this is gathering knowledge about people and the entire population is a totalitarian procedure. That was the first thing that hit me right away. This was obvious, the route we were taking. And so that's why I've been opposing it since they started it in 2001.
How would you describe a panopticon?
I'm not really good at doing it, that kind of thing.
Do you know what it is?
It's not clear to me.
Okay. I'll just explain. You don't have to address it at all, but just so we're on the same page. East India Company employed this guy named Jeremy Bentham, and Bentham was asked to create a metaphorical prison that they ended up trying to build in Russia later. But it's the guard towers had mirrors on it, and so it could see all the prisoners at the same time. So the prisoners always think that they're being watched, but they can never see if there's somebody in the guard tower pointing a gun at them. They just know that sometimes people get shot from the guard tower, and it's a state of living in fear and using fear to control people's actions.
Well, I mean, yeah, okay, that's the state we're in. I mean, fear mongering is the way our government's been operating. Fear mongering first for terrorism, to build up the budget, and now they've been playing that card too many times. Now they're looking at cybersecurity as the next fear, and then they'll find something else later on. The point is, and they never really want to solve the problem. That's been the basic issue with it, because once you solve the problem, you don't have the problem to have justification to get more money. So my version of their vision statement came out like this: that for them, it's keep the problem going so the money keeps flowing. I mean, otherwise, if you solve the problem, you don't have that problem to justify more money and more of an empire, and to sustain your empire. So that's really what they're operating. Originally, I thought it was, aim low and miss was their vision statement, because everything they ever did, they failed at. I didn't quite understand it till the latter part of my career, that they were really not solving the problem because they didn't want to. It was a matter of keeping it going so they can get the next contract or get the next set of budget from the Congress and so on. Keep it going.
And when left in the dark, they've been pointing those budgets at us. They've been targeting Americans, and we can talk about the potentials of kill lists and things like that are floating around in our world these days. But they're pointing this technology that's coming from taxpayer money back at the taxpayers, which seems very, much like, East Germany or Soviet Union.
Well, you have to look at it also in order to do the bulk acquisition of data. The largest amount of data is being passed around inside the United States, other than around the world. I mean, the pockets of where information is really ballooning are in the United States, in Europe, and in Japan, and in Korea, South Korea, and so on. Those are the big areas. In fact, 80% of the fiber optic network for transporting the communications of the world really is within the United States, or passing through the United States. So that this is really what they call the hometown advantage, being able to monitor the communications, for example, of South Americans. Because the South American cables run from South America to Miami and then back down to South America. That's not by chance, by the way. That gives us a look into everything that's going down there, and they can then capture all that information from places inside the United States. They don't have to be overseas to do it. So that's true for about 80% of it, but the other 20% is where they have to. That's really the target they should be looking at, really. Not the internal United States, but they decided that with bulk acquisition of data, U.S. citizens were first. We were the first ones collected that way. So the rest of the world is no more than being treated simply just like all the rest of us, all of us U.S. citizens. So we're all being treated the same.
Recently, I saw a headline come out of the London Guardian, I believe it was, where you said that the reason that NSA was surveilling its own population was for totalitarian population control. Can you say that again in your own words? Again,
it falls back to the principles of totalitarianism and how dictators and so on have operated down through the centuries. I mean, It's know what your people are doing and find the ones who are not conforming to what you want them to do, and then get rid of them. And that's fundamentally what this process does. It gives them that kind of knowledge about everyone in the country. And if you start to speak up about some issue or something, you get noticed, and then they have all that data already assembled on you, and they simply go compile it and look at it and see how they could influence you to do what they would conceive to be the right thing. So that's how you use it against people, and you make sure that they know that you know about what they've got, and so then they fear you one way or the other, or will conform to your wishes, if they can't find anything on you specifically, but they can find something on someone you care about, then they'll use that against you. So it's just like that's standard KGB tactics also.
Well, in terms of population control, I think what you're pointing out is they're trying to change the attitudes, values, behaviors, and beliefs of a target population to be more easily malleable and controlled by authority.
Actually, they don't have to do that. All they have to do is make sure that everybody knows what they're doing. Then people basically change what they're doing. I mean, people I know have already changed how they operate, how they communicate internationally, how they, for example, Chris Hedges, who has said to me, he's finding it very difficult to do any investigative reporting anymore because he can't find any sources that will talk to him, and so they're not talking. So they're modifying their behavior, whereas they would used to talk to him about things off the record. Now they can't do that, or they don't do that because they're afraid of being monitored. And the existing government is threatening everybody with prosecution if they leak. For example, they still have 9 prosecutions pending on the Espionage Act from 1917 with I think 9 different people who have been whistleblowers, classic whistleblowers, and they're trying to silence that, and that's the way they threaten people. And so people internally in government have changed how they operate. They no longer are willing to talk to anybody that's a reporter. And so that's changing how we no longer have a free press that can interrogate and probe into government activities.
What would freedom look like in America if privacy was restored and the NSA was following the Constitution, for instance?
Well, you would actually be what the founders of this country envisioned as what it should be. It is a country where people have the freedom to be creative and innovative without having the fear of being observed or disapproved of, even before they can try to institute or start to implement an idea that they had. So that's how civilization advances. When you take away that freedom to feel like you can do anything here, the sky is the limit here, you aren't bounded by anything, then you take that away. Why? People withdraw like they did in East Germany or in the Soviet Union. They become very withdrawn, afraid to do anything because their next door neighbor or some other person would be spying on them and reporting them. And so they stagnate as a civilization. They become drunkards, and like they did in the Soviet Union, a lot of alcoholics in the Soviet Union, because they were frustrated. They couldn't feel that they had the freedom to be creative and innovative, and that destroys human aspirations, basically.
Are you optimistic about the future of freedom?
Actually, it's one of the main problems I see is that this way of doing bulk acquisition of information on the population is spreading through the democracies of the world. It's not a question of just creating it here in the U.S. I mean, we are spreading this around the world. I mean, the Five Eyes are using it, and it's spreading to some other countries. There are other cooperative efforts with third parties under a program called Rampart A, where they're starting to do the same kind of thing. And this kind of knowledge and information about the population is being used by law enforcement through the MLAT mutual law enforcement agreements and treaties, and it's being used worldwide. So the people cooperating, other law enforcement agencies around the world that cooperate with the FBI or the DEA, they will get information from the NSA indirectly and never be told it's coming from that, but they can act on that. And then when they do, they have to do their own. They have to create their own what they call parallel construction to create information that's admissible in a court. Since the NSA data wasn't collected with a warrant, it can't be admitted in court. So it's inadmissible. So they have to do a parallel construction, then, which means go find the kind of implicating information that would give probable cause to do what you're doing, arresting them, and do it through normal policing procedures. Then we'll use that data in court, substitute for the NSA data, so they perjure themselves there in court. And I call that a planned program perjury policy run by the Department of Justice of the United States. And now they're spreading it around the world, so they're subverting our judicial system inside this country also, and they're not just doing it here, they're spreading it around the world. So, well, you know, we all need to be concerned about this around the world, not just here in the United States. We may have started it, but off the model of the Soviet Union and the Stasi, I might add, and but we're spreading it, and that's even more criminal in my mind.
Bill, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small town in central western Pennsylvania, up in the hills, up in the Appalachian Hills. So I'm a genuine hillbilly, so to speak.
What value was placed on honesty, hard work, integrity, and character in your upbringing?
Well, in this town, I mean, you know, it was only 2,800, 3,200 people at the time, I think. It's down to 28 now, 2,800. At the time, you know, everybody basically knew everybody else. So what you were was what constituted your character. And so everything you did reflected on the character of person you were. And that's how people knew you in the town. So everything, all the values, the decency and so on that people treated each other with were all part of that growing up. And people cared for one another there. They looked after each other. So they were the basic values of humanity. So.
Well, they're the basic values of community. You were brought up around honest people in rural Pennsylvania, and then you moved to D.C. and you got a job in government. Did you find out that your ideas growing up were somewhat naive compared to how things are?
Well, actually not initially anyway. So, I mean, the first 28 or 30 years I was in government, I was of course working the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact. That at the time was the highest priority problem and the highest priority threat that we perceived as a country. So basically anything I always treated people the same way I did. I was treated when I grew up. So I was always also working on the most important problems in the place. So I didn't really have recognized any change in that, because people really return the kinds of what you project to people, they kind of project back to you. So I didn't perceive of anything at that point to do anything. Besides, everybody in the country and in the NSA wanted me to continue doing what I was doing, because I was kind of successful at it. So they liked the outcome, gave clear knowledge of what the potential foes were doing. So they wanted that to continue. It was only in the later part of my career there, from about 1995 on, when I started getting involved with contracting and the shift from the problem that I had been working Soviet Union and so on, that I got into areas where people were getting lots of money in contracts, and so solving problems in that arena was also my objective, because that was the main problem we were facing, was the digital explosion at the time. So that got me directly into the solving problems that nobody really wanted solved there. And so when I did that, that kind of caused reactions that I didn't think I would get. I thought people would adopt those solutions and run with them and try to improve on them if they could, which was an expectation that I was clearly disappointed at, because no one really wanted to do that. In fact, they still don't, because again, they're still building their empire with different fear-mongering topics. The latest, of course, is cybersecurity and so on.
Well, and problem solving is a way of finding truth. So my
Right.
question would be, what value does philosophy have in your life, and how would you define truth?
Uh, truth, you could say there's a variation of truth depending on who's looking at it, but there's also a physical truth, and that physical truth is or is not. So there's kind of when you look at, for example, when you're doing signals intelligence, you're looking at abstract things, the communications of people and their metadata and other kinds of things that they're saying. You may not be able to read their things, so they may be encrypted, and you can't read that. So you have to try to interpret that. But underlying all of that is a physical reality that's happening. Now, either that physical reality is happening or it's not, and that's the truth of it. So what you're trying to do in the business of intelligence, anyway, is get to that underlying truth, the physical reality, and it's not something like for example, in 1968, the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia. That's a basic fundamental truth. That happened, and it's not open to interpretation. You've got